is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish in Oklahoma City and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. As we all know, this weekend, Advent is beginning. It's the time when we focus on what God has done and what we can do. It's not an accident that this is the season of beginning our next year of prayer in the church. Advent means to appear, to begin, to initiate, to reveal. And so it begins for us now. We approach God as a kind of question to be answered often. This is the approach motivated by skepticism and uncertainty, all of which is fine. This is the age of uncertainty, and generally we ask to be persuaded about the important things in life rather than just accepting what we're told and going along with what others say, except for the times in our lives when we do go along and care not a whit for what is proof and what's necessary. Then we go along with the currents of our lives with scarcely a question to ask or to answer. And the contemporary unconcern about God is regarded as needing no proof at all. I'll get to that later. And we don't have to apologize for this approach about needing proof for God. It has been formed in the backwash of history over the last 500 years or so. There's no need for us to apologize for these forces of skepticism at work among us, coursing along in the remotest places and among the most common of us. We're all the products of the wide world and its energies. At the time of the Reformation, 500 years ago, we Catholics were asked to prove the content of our beliefs in our devotional life. This was a product of the times in which professors and the leaders of the Reformation were mostly all university teachers and authors. The professors asked the why of the life of the church. And for its time, getting to the bottom of things was legitimate. After all, we shouldn't just go along generation after generation being carried along by blind trust in what our ancestors did. We should be able to talk about what we want and what we do without any fear or distress. So when the reformers looked up and began asking for the reasons behind the prayers and practices of the church, they were doing their part. And the Catholics, we were doing our part to answer. Except, of course, this all happened not in a classroom, but in the riotous times of the Reformation. This was a time in which people were being hanged for what they believed or did believe. It was the time in which a particular interpretation of a verse of Scripture could put a man in jail for life, or cause a family to be stripped of its lands, or cause a monastery to have its monks kicked out into the street. Questions became weapons, and answers were turned into ammunition by Protestants and by Catholics. Asking became assaults, and answering became ambushes. There was hardly a moment in which anyone could pause to listen to or think about or weigh what was said. What God wanted became contentious, and what the will of God should be for each person became a kind of banner to wave in front of armies, a sign of where to go and which side to be on. It was a tough time then. Added to this pushing and shoving was the invention of science, which is itself a whole series of questions and answers. For the entire age, the focus became looking and finding. And the area for answering wasn't just in the book of God's words in the Scripture, but also in the book of God's actions in nature. Suddenly, minds were turned to the operation of the forces and dynamics of the natural world, rather than simply being the true intentions and the actual expressions of the author of books in the Bible. And the ultimate question began to be asked: was there a God at all? And if there is, how do you prove it? If God does exist, and if God is present to us in the world, what are we to do? Questions began to inhabit everything concerning the presence of God to us. There were good answers. We are a people of faith. Careful believers had been asked and had been answered and had been answering these questions for centuries. There was plenty of ammunition available for anyone who cared to spend some time learning to fire back at the skeptics, whether in the aisles of churches or in the university lecture halls. After all, Christians have been defending their faith for a long time, and we Catholics enjoy the reflections and the insights of some of the smartest people ever to have lived in the world. When it came time to provide reasons for what we believe, or to experience the fullness of faith in an age of unbelief, we knew what to say. But when the dialogue is questions and the content is answers, the conversation looks different. If someone asks you, for example, to prove that the woman who raised you, whom everyone told you to call mom, if somebody asks you if she was really your mother, the conversation would look strange. You'd be forced to talk about issues and actualities you'd never once mention if you were talking about everyday life at home. You'd be detailing DNA tests and facial features and the nature of inheritance rather than describing being held and cared for and loved. While it's legitimate to ask, it's legitimate to talk about legitimacy. Let's face it, proving your mom is your mother, really and truly, is about as warm and congenial as proving, that piston engines can run on alcohol. It can be exciting for some minds that run in those directions, where proofs are lively and logic is life. But for the most of us, we'd rather recall when we were hugged on our birthdays or kissed when we were hurt. Talking about God is, it's like a bottle of wine. The climate of time creates the flavor in the vintage. And for a very long time, our talk about God, inside of and outside of the church, has been about as exciting as talking about electrical wiring, which is why it's so often that we run into those who've given up on the whole thing. Young people tell me they're not interested in the church. It just doesn't interest them anymore because I'm not that kind of person, they tell me. What they're often saying is that they aren't interested in the back and forth of questions and answers anymore. God, as the answer to questions they're not interested in, is of no importance to them. So they give up on anything like belief. And when they hear a question like, do you believe in God? They're really hearing something like, don't you know the right answer you're supposed to give? The whole conversation becomes uninteresting. Not only that, the young person is convinced they're being authentic, maybe even courageous, by walking away from a conversation like that. But no one can talk about the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Jesus, Peter, and Paul as if this reality were only the subject matter of apologetics, or if we were trying only to solve an equation. God, as revealed in the Scriptures, is engaged in relationship, not just academics. In the Scriptures, God reached out to engage the people of His choosing, not simply to make sure they were believing the right things, but so that they knew of the plans for them that He had and for their lives. If we want to invite others into a new way of encountering God, we have to speak to them of responding to the divine desire to be a part of God's plan for them. It's not being sure we have the correct response. It's a matter of inviting everyone to find God who wants to walk with them. There are two moments that come to me when I think of this aspect of renewal. That is, thinking about the question of whether God is in my life and wants to walk with me or not. The first is a bumper sticker that made the rounds decades ago. I used to laugh at it when I saw it then, but now I think that those who showed it really had something to communicate. The bumper sticker said, "God's not dead. I spoke to Him this morning." It's facile, I know, and it hardly gets to the tough questions about God's existence. But then again, it is a confession that the existence of God in our lives is one that we can begin to explore personally. If we want to know if God matters to us, we could take the time to find out. It's not difficult and it's not esoteric. We simply have to desire to establish a relationship. And we do that, and we begin by praying. And the other is from the third page of the Bible. This is from the third chapter of Genesis. In it, God comes into the garden after Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When they did this, their eyes were opened, they realized they were naked, and as they realized it, they heard God moving about in the garden, so they ran and hid. I know we can object to all of the language describing God as if He were the school principal or the master of the plantation, and we can complain about the story being juvenile in its descriptions. We're all smarter than to think of God as the dad of the universe who likes to stroll in the evening breezes and enjoy the day. But we all know it is a real story. It describes exactly what happens to us. When we have sinned, our eyes are opened to the evil that we've done, and when we realize this monumental truth about ourselves, we run and hide ourselves away from those who might come to know this about us. This story is powerful because it describes the dynamics of self-knowledge and self-understanding so completely. It was written at the height of the Bronze Age, but it delves into the psychology of the moment perfectly. It's not too bad for a story that's 3,000 years old. But the heart of the story is God's response. When it's clear Adam and Eve are not in their accustomed spot, God calls out to Adam and says, "Where are you?" Adam has to respond. The heart of the story is evident. God is in search of man. Our instinct is to hide. God's desire is to reveal. And there is the heart of the story for all of us today. God wishes to reveal himself as the one who is in search of us. And God wants to reveal what man is and what he has become. God's revelation is of humanity, not just of divinity. The man pled that he was naked, and therefore he became afraid. God revealed that this fear was the product of Adam's sin and the rightful conclusion of his thinking. And the rest of the story of the Bible is what God does on the third page. All the rest of those next 1,000 pages is that God goes in search of Adam. The people of Israel, the Exodus, the law, the prophets, and the drama of the Messiah, all of this is God calling out to the sons of Adam, that is, to us. Most of us have spent our lives hiding because we've sought out the shade as we've noticed our nakedness. You tell me that's not true. Once we've passed being about 8 years old or so, we begin to develop a moral conscience and we realize our participation in the rottenness of the world. When we do, we run to hide away from what's true and real about ourselves as we look for the shade. Most of psychotherapy is figuring out how deeply into the shade we've run and how much it'll take to find our way back into the light. God comes in search of us. That's the story of God's existence. God comes into our lives to bring us into the light. This is the offer made to us by all of the accoutrements of God at work in the world. I mean, the scriptures, the church, the catechism, mass, the sacraments, prayer, and all the rest of what we know about the practice of religion. They're all the means by which we're invited to enter into relationship with God. It's our way to hear God's voice calling out our names, just as Adam heard his name. A couple of weeks ago, a couple spoke to me about a retreat that they'd been on. Like most people, they'd been skating through life with their problems and difficulties with one another. Their lives have been tough and their decisions have been tenuous. A lot of water passed under the bridge with each other, and they haven't always have made the right choices. Life hasn't been easy for them. And like so many of us, they were wounded in their lives when they were children, and those wounds prompted the wounds that they inflicted on others and each other. The hurt they received was like a poison or an infection. They passed it on to everyone in their lives. Hearing them talk about themselves, they were captured in a complicated web of mistakes and injuries and sins and anger that stuck to them. They were like all of us are. But at this retreat, something happened for them. They both had an experience of God in which they felt the divine presence, the offer of forgiveness and healing. It was overwhelming for them. For the first time in their lives together, they knew they were accompanied by God's promises to be with them. They heard God's voice calling out to them. It wasn't a moment in which everything suddenly became perfect. The ruin of their lives still surrounded them, including the wounds that they had inflicted on each other. Just as the healing of an injured organ or a deep cut takes time and begins with cleaning it out and disinfecting it, so they had to begin to clean themselves of the debris in their lives and to figure out how to keep it from re-injuring them. It was painful, as it always is, and it happens only slowly. But they know God is with them. God reached out to them and came to them in their need. God is in relationship with us, is real to us, and calls out to us. What they found is what God continually offers, His presence in their lives. Of course, the first objection to this description is that this overwhelming experience doesn't happen for everyone. Not every person in that kind of need has a moment in which the love of God touches them so deeply. There are many, many people we know who could use an interrupted moment, a blinding light, a tip off of his horse to find a new pathway to life. If only something would happen to make such a moment for them, we'd all be happy. Even those who don't believe in God have a list of those whose pains are so profound and whose sadness is so deep, they'd be delighted to know the darkness of their lives have been illumined. So why doesn't God act for them? I don't know why. I have a friend whose grandchild is troubled beyond all imagining. He's trapped in his addictions. Over and over again, he has been unable to find his way through life in a way that gives him life. If only God would provide a moment in which he could grasp the promise of wholeness and healing that he needs and set his feet on a pathway to true life. But that hasn't happened yet. Or at least if he has heard the voice of God calling him out of the shadows, he has not yet identified that voice for what it is, and he hasn't been able to say yes to it. However, all that being the case, I do know God calls, and the call is for man's good, and that we are not abandoned. God desires our relationship and wants to be present in us in our lives. Often this happens in a moment of crisis and fear when our day-to-day expectations have been interrupted. Sometimes that's criticized as the cry from desperation. When the person is in need, that person will grasp at any straw or consider anything for help. It's the foxhole conversion. That's not actually a complaint or a criticism, as a Dominican father once put it in one of his books. He said that a person in a foxhole, vulnerable and fearful, his life interrupted of all of the comforts of life and being threatened with being killed at any moment, that person may be able to make a good decision for the first time in his life. Like Adam, he hears God's voice speaking to him about his nakedness, and he hears it only when he knew he was naked. It's like that for a lot of us. Not only are we invited into a relationship with God, our relationship is comprehensive and complete. By this I mean the whole of our lives is brought into correlation with God's presence. A story of the gospel is a good example of this. Remember the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus? They were dejected by Jesus' crucifixion, and after the Sabbath day were heading out of Jerusalem to go back home. A stranger joined them on the road and asked them about their journey. All day they talked with them about their dashed hope in Jesus the Nazarene and the prospect of him being the Messiah. As they did, this stranger kept assuring them that the suffering of the chosen one proved his identity as God's own. At the end of the day, they paused and broke bread together. When they did, they suddenly realized the stranger was, in fact, Jesus himself, risen from the dead. In the story, the writer adds this detail. They not only knew it was Jesus with them at the table, but that he himself had been with them all day long. They could look back and understand Jesus had been part of the journey even when they were lost in their despondence and their grief. Their journey had been part of God's revelation to them. And that's the promise made to all of us. God not only calls out to us and seeks us out in our lives, we are assured that God is already present to us in the shadows of where we're living. We know God has taken the initiative to come along in our lives, to be a part of where we are, and to walk beside us on the road. One of the most common stories we have is that we're able to look back and see where God has been with us once we begin to know God's revealing presence. It happens all the time. When I was in my senior year of seminary college, for example, I had fixed on the idea of being sent to Europe to study. My friend, Anthony Taylor, now Bishop Taylor of Little Rock, he had gone to Rome to study at the end of his time in college. I thought that going off to Europe would be the apex of opportunity in the seminary. So in about April of my last semester, I got news that the Archbishop was going to send me to Belgium to go to school. That, in fact, was an old Oklahoma tradition to go to Belgium. I was happy to know I was going to get my wish. But that same night, when I went to bed, I couldn't get comfortable. I had achieved my wish, but none of it had made me happy. So finally, in a moment of calling out to God, I knew what I had to do. I had to acknowledge that this was not what God wanted of me. Going off to Europe was my will, not God's. So I stayed home to go to school in the U.S. And because I did, I had 2 extra years of Christmases and Easters and summers with my father. The guys in Europe were always gone for 2 whole years before they could come back home. And at the end of those 2 extra years that I had at home, my father died. I also had the opportunity to begin studying Spanish, which formed my priesthood and changed my life in every way. I look back and I know that the Lord was my shepherd in every step. My restlessness was a gift to me. While I didn't know it, that uncomfortable night was God's voice asking me where I was, and I give thanks every day that I could answer. God is a real presence in our lives, more than an answer to a question or the side we're on. God is waiting for all of us to answer the call that is extended to us. I know it's not always clear exactly what we're supposed to do or how we're able to answer, and we shouldn't be put off by that indefiniteness. It's the same in every relationship. The boyfriend doesn't know exactly what his girlfriend means, even when he talks with her every day. Children aren't always certain about their parents' instructions or even their parents' love. It can take us a whole lifetime to find out how much our father or mother cherished us. Even the most transactional relationship in life, they're filled with ambiguity, which is why we have lawyers. Often we aren't hearing what's being said or know what our own decisions mean. That happens in every relationship. God shouldn't be shut out of a relationship because we're not certain about the ways of the divine. We're almost never perfectly clear about any call in our lives, which is why we stick around to listen. If it's important, we'll find out. Suffice it to say, all of us are invited to live out the promise of God's call in our lives. It's important. This season is called Advent because we're reminded that God is the one who has begun this. All the years of history from Adam's first breath up to the moment of Jesus' birth was the divine preparation for the revelation of God's desire for relationship with us. With Jesus' birth into the world, God became man and dwelt among us. God's call to us is heard and can be answered by every part of our humanity. This is the season when we remember what God has done to make this important moment for us. We celebrate all of the beginnings God has made, especially this one great moment in which we can hear and say yes to this call to us in our shadows. Not only that, we are assured from the time of Jesus' birth at that time all the way to the news on TV this morning that God has been calling. We're all invited to respond with our "Here I am," and to hear God's footsteps next to us on every part of our journey. Our own Advent is when we begin. God wants to walk with us, beginning now. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Alchemy. In days of old, the alchemists strove to transmute base lead into solid gold, desiring to transform poverty to wealth and push society by magicians' stealth. Their pursuits were not only material ones, they also wanted souls' transmutations, that everyday, common stuff would suffice and be enough. We laugh now at their pursuit to bear metallic and soulful fruit, but the effort to change everything is not for now slackened or grown fringe. Today, the pursuit of alchemy has taken on a new respectability. As long imprecations formulaic, nothing at all remains prosaic. Flesh and blood are no sure stop to transmutation of bottom to top, so that what once was of men becomes all that of women. By the secrets held in secret words will the deepest foundations disturb, so that all was fixed does then depart, and manly flesh dissolves its manly heart. That's alchemy. Advent has just begun. We'll be here for the next several weeks exploring what it means to be living Catholic. I hope that you can join us then as we go on this journey together.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.